Okay, everybody. Today, my guest is Colin Booth. He is a staff writer and chief political correspondent for the Courier Newsroom and Granite Post, and he's also the co-host of Granite Gaming. It's a Twitch channel where they play video games and talk about politics. So let's see here. Colin, how are you doing today?
Yo, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, it's always good to get new voices and faces on the channel. So yeah, I'm just really excited to dive in. So I guess first off, like, tell me about Granite Post and sort of like your position, what you're doing, what your goals are, maybe a little bit about your background, just so that we can sort of introduce you to people.
Yeah, totally. So Colin Booth, I am the chief political correspondent at Granite Post, which is a part of Courier Newsroom. Which, if you are chronically online, if you're on TikTok, if you're on Instagram, you've probably seen our posts. We do both Granite Post and Courier Newsroom. Courier Newsroom does, a lot of major national reporting on digital reporting when it comes to what's going on at the federal level, what's going on with the Trump administration. A lot of accountability reporting there, very viral graphics and videos. And here in New Hampshire at the Granite Post, we kind of take a similar tact. We are really big on, well, for me anyway, because I'm the political reporter, really big on accountability reporting on state politics, and very much with a digital focus. We are probably the fastest growing newsroom in the state in terms of readers. We are the highest TikTok follower count of any newsroom in the state, fastest growing on Instagram. And so we do a lot of video work. We do a lot of graphics just on what's happening in state politics. And we also publish on our website, publish full news stories. So we do a lot of traditional journalism too, but our real focus is on digital and video. I think that's where our biggest strength is. We also have a very strong community focus where we cover cute listicles, the highly engaging community content. I don't write that so much, so I can't speak too much to it, but I know we do great work there.
Yeah, sure. So would you say that just in general at the moment you're sort of like, I guess, readership base, or is like you're probably pulling like a much younger audience because it's so much more online? Would you say that's true, or do you think that it's more just sort of across the spectrum? I mean, like, New Hampshire is a pretty aging state, so there's always that aspect of things, but I'm just curious as to sort of what the numbers behind it are like.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is a pretty big cross section of the entire state. And you mentioned Granite Gaming, which is a new project we're working on, which is actually our effort to kind of reach more younger folks. But it varies by platform in terms of what our audience looks like. But we really reach a huge amount of demographics kind of across the spectrum. Obviously, we do trend younger on some platforms like TikTok, but when you look at something like Facebook or Instagram, it's kind of across the board. And like you said, New Hampshire is an older state, so when you're talking about younger, relatively, you might be talking about people in their 40s and 50s. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. No, that's definitely is a very important thing to note. Younger in this state does not necessarily mean young. So I guess, like, in general, you say you guys report a lot on the Trump administration, and people are probably familiar with apps and aggregators like, say, Ground News. I know there's like if you're like a YouTube watcher, there's a lot of ads on channels for Ground News and whatever. So the main facet of that would be to say describing what the lean of an outlet is. And so I'm just kind
hmm.
of curious, what, like, as far as Granite Post goes, how would you, as sort of the chief political correspondent, describe that position of the outlet itself?
I think you look at New Hampshire, it has probably one of the most mature and robust conservative media ecosystems in the country. And so our tact is we're, as Courier is broadly, we are refer to ourselves as pro-democracy media. We are an organization that is really focused on a healthy and vibrant democracy, and I think our coverage really reflects that. I think as a result of that, you'll see us maybe pulling more center left on a number of issues. Um, and you kind of take the political lean of the right, which has, of course, moved very far to the right in the last decade. And so it may, to some, I think a lot of this is very dependent on where you stand politically. I think
Yeah,
we're
I
more
mean,
on the center left right now, but obviously,
you're talking about like the Overton window shift that exists within media itself, right? Like
right, yeah,
if you've got the right wing that's just going further and further and further, eventually anything that even would be considered remotely centrist in say like the 80s or the 90s is now suddenly described by people on the right as being far left, and it gets a little convoluted.
absolutely. And we do a lot of accountability journalism. And here in New Hampshire, we, of course, have a Republican supermajority. Republicans are in charge of the state legislature, they're in charge of the governor's office. Basically, every major state agency, the state Supreme Court, is stacked with Republicans from the top to the bottom. So if you're doing accountability work, you're going to be, working on the party that's in power. So, but
Right.
yeah,
No, I didn't mean to cut you off if you have more to sort of go on about that, but
no, I could go on all day about any number of things, but
yeah, fair enough. So, I mean, I guess this sort of is we'll just dive into that first issue because I think you kind of like open the door to it a little bit here. You talked about the conservative supermajority in the state, and that ties directly into a very broad national conversation that's occurring right now, especially with what's going on in both Texas and California, on both sides of the aisle in terms of gerrymandering and the process of handling redistricting and how that works. So, I think maybe it's healthy to start out by sort of explaining to folks how redistricting itself works and what role that plays in sort of as you pointed out, you guys are a more pro-democracy outlet. So I'm sort of curious, how does the process of gerrymandering via redistricting undermine or ultimately affect democracy?
well, I think the fundamental issue is the idea that voters choose their representatives, not the other way around, right? That is the very heart of it. The idea that you live in a society, you live in a state, you live somewhere where if you aren't happy with the people you have elected, that can change. And so gerrymandering is the process of basically changing that, right? It is redrawing your district, redrawing the place you live, the election map in such a way that is significantly harder and benefits the party that's currently in power. And so that is something we're seeing. Republicans and Democrats both do that to a certain extent. Republicans do it much more. I think there's I can't remember the exact breakdown, but Republicans benefit uh, I think something like 6 congressional seats, maybe it's more, uh, from gerrymandering, at a national level. And so now we're seeing, like you mentioned, in Texas, Republicans at the behest of the Trump administration trying to get something like 6 more seats just in that state alone, which really is, I mean, a pretty terrifying prospect. The idea um, that Republicans are trying to entrench themselves in a state like that, and basically, remove the idea of the opposition party having any say in how the state is represented in Washington D.C. It's a pretty frightening prospect. And then in California, like you said, that Gavin Newsom is basically threatening to equalize that. It's a response to that threat, because California, of course, very also a large state, just like Texas, and also has competitive districts for both parties. But he's saying, well, we could just neutralize that by doing it ourselves. And it's interesting to watch Republicans be outraged by that, but not the first thing. So yeah, that's
Yeah, I
what's
mean,
going.
I think it's kind of wild, right? So when I think about like it, the way I think about what's happening in Texas, right? You see they're sort of asking the FBI to go find these representatives that are breaking quorum. And what I think is sort of hilarious about that is it's like, hey, we're going to punish you guys. We're going to try and throw you in jail for not letting us cheat harder. Like that, ultimately, that's sort of the way it reads to me. It's, I guess, like, for a lot of people, I think, like, if the concept of redistricting and gerrymandering is like is alien to a certain extent, I feel like a good analogy is actually looking at like the Electoral College, because I think a lot of people do understand when we're talking about a presidential race that the Electoral College is in a sense kind of like reducing our direct access to democracy in the way that people would understand it, right? Because you're taking the amount of votes based off of the population and you're sort of boiling it down into delegates, which then gives certain states a lot more control over what's happening in Washington than other states. So you have, depending on what state you're in, your vote literally can be described as being worth less votes than someone in a different state because of the amount of super delegates that they have that they can send to conventions to uh, elect people, or conversely, like just on the national scale, what those delegations vote for in the national uh, sort of general election.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's tough because I think our collective memory is really short these days, and so coming out of an election where the electoral college didn't have as big of an impact, or I guess if we had gone through another election where the popular vote hadn't been in line with the electoral college, I think we would be in a much different place today in terms of the public sentiment around the electoral college, or maybe even like public understanding around it, because I feel like we're not hearing about that conversation as much. But like you said, I do think there are a lot of parallels between the two, because the idea that we are suppressing people's votes, that we are removing people's agency at the ballot box with these moves is, I mean, it's obviously incredibly concerning.
So I think, um,
Mm.
in general, I think it's just sort of like elucidates the problem that we're disconnected from direct control over elected officials in a lot of ways because of these redistricting efforts. Um, in New Hampshire, you guys pointed out actually on your Granite Gaming stream that New Hampshire generally votes blue. You'll see uh, in elections the actual popular vote leaning Democratic. You'll have a lot more blue votes, and yet you have a lot more capture of the state house, which is, I want to point out, the largest state house in the country, and actually I think it's either number 2 or number 3 largest in the world. It's incredibly massive, and so it's important to consider sort of like the capture of seats in a political sense in New Hampshire through these redistricting efforts. So if you're able to sort of like expound more upon that topic, I think it would be useful for people that watch to maybe have a more granular concept of how that operates.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Like you said, New Hampshire has the largest state legislature in the country. There are 400 seats for just the House alone. There's 24 Senate seats. We have a 5-member executive council, which basically acts as the lieutenant governor you would see in other states. And then we, of course, have a governor. And so you look at past elections, years like 2022, 2020, we saw Democrats win the popular vote for those legislative bodies. So Democrats, I think in 2022, won roughly like 51% of the popular vote, both the House and the Senate. And then you saw Republicans actually take the majority in those seats because the seats in the House are gerrymandered. And then in the state Senate, it's even worse. I think Democrats won 50% of the seats, and then Democrats won like 51% of the vote, 50-something% of the vote, a little more than a majority. And then Republicans, I think, took 60% of the seats, something outrageous, right? And then the executive council is even worse. Republicans, I think it was another 50-50 split, and Republicans took 80% of the seats. And so you're seeing like the effects, like New Hampshire has been gerrymandered for a very, very long time, and Republicans are trying to gerrymander it even further. And it's interesting because, and this is one of the insidious things about gerrymandering, that it can happen and then exist for so long, and you forget how unfair things actually are, how corrupt, like you live in institutional corruption for so long. Institutional corruption just becomes the mundane everyday life. It becomes the baseline. And then Republicans come forward and they say they want to gerrymander again because they are able to convince the public that, that we live in a normal society, that things are normal now. And we're seeing this because Republicans are trying to gerrymander the congressional districts now.
Right. It's
And
like a frog in a boiling pot kind of analogy type thing.
Right. Yeah. And the frog is at this point, a soupy foam at the top of the pot. And the Republicans are basically saying, turn the heat up even more. And so that's kind of where we are in terms of gerrymandering here in New Hampshire, where there were multiple past elections where Democrats won the popular vote, Republicans held the majority. And the thing, there's like multiple levels of why this is problematic. That I've worked in New Hampshire politics for a long time. I worked as a reporter here for a while, and kind of watching it play out in that time is pretty wild. So like there is the idea that we are badly demoralizing the public. When more people vote for your party and they still lose, it's very hard to communicate why that is. And like also like if you lose, like even after you have won the popular vote, like how do you communicate that to the public? Like, well, it was rigged. Well, that's very demoralizing, but it also is a situation where people they then think the state party is incompetent, right? They think that the people running these elections or the elected leaders are incompetent when they won, but the structures that that Republicans put in place basically ensured that they're there. It also creates these long-lasting, when a party wins an election and when they are able to maintain power for a long period of time, a lot of times they're better at holding on to power later, right? Because they are able to project strength, they're able to kind of shore up their resources. People like throwing money at winners. It makes their fundraising operation better. It makes them able to attract their political talent. And so when you create these institutional imbalances, when you create institutional corruption like this through gerrymandering, you really are, it's so devastating long-term for democracy, but it's also devastating for the people of New Hampshire. You look at like where the priorities of Republicans are right now in terms of the state legislature. We've got, prices rising from tariffs. The cost of living is really going up dramatically. New Hampshire is in the midst of a housing crisis like we've never seen before. An entry-level house is like $500,000 here or more.
Right. We just
Uh,
granted more rights to landlords to evict tenants as well. That was a new law that AOT just signed into law. So, I mean, I
yes.
I did a video about this where it's like we're looking at sort of this compounding situation where if you have increasing house prices or rental prices, as the case may be. I mean, granted, it's across the board, right? You've got rising property taxes in general because that's our only mechanism to really fund things on the state level, especially something like education, which, as a side note, a significant amount of money is being siphoned off to school vouchers. So you've got that one component of it. You then have sort of the increased risk of people being put out of their home if they're renters. It's increasingly difficult for those people who are now displaced to find a new location to live because the prices have gone up. And then additionally, you've sort of got this national climate of essentially criminalizing homelessness right now. So it's it's a compounded effort that's going on. And that's I find that to be incredibly terrifying.
Yeah, and if you so right, and we are, as a state, as a country, facing all of these crises that are really hurting, you know, people who aren't focused on the politics, right? These are, working families in New Hampshire are, they don't care about the political drama, um, but they are feeling the devastating, effects of where the economy is and where it's headed, and the fact that it's getting worse. And if you look at like the social media accounts of basically every major Republican political figure in the state right now, and Republican media especially, they're not focused on that. They're focused on gerrymandering. They're focused on rewriting New Hampshire's districts to benefit Republicans so they can maintain power even longer. There's even a situation where one legislative leader in the executive council basically reached out to try and protect the state from this gerrymandering, and now they're calling, Republicans in the state are calling for her impeachment, saying that she in some way didn't follow the correct procedure to do that. So it's a pretty remarkable situation, and the aggressiveness with which we're seeing Republicans kind of pursue this agenda, I think taking a tact from the Trump administration, kind of watching their moves and basically mimicking it. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable thing, and it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see if the public has an appetite for this kind of stuff in the midterms.
Yeah, and I think something that's maybe something I feel like is worth pointing out here, right, is if you look at sort of the general ethos of the Republican Party, especially the Republican Party in New Hampshire right now, which I want to make a note has experienced a significant takeover from libertarians in the Free State Project, who've been working here for like decades now to gain more of a foothold. The sort of in broad strokes, the Free State Project basically is a consortium of libertarians that basically looked at states in the country and they said, okay, what state is the most sort of amenable or susceptible to changes that would service our end goals? And for anybody that understands the sort of right libertarian movement as it exists in the United States in sort of this contemporary moment, is essentially the idea of minimizing the government as much as possible, right? So, what's the best mechanism to do that? Well, you want to disenfranchise voters and basically make it so that they feel that government is not working for them or that their vote does not matter, right? So, one of the best mechanisms to do this on a more granular level is to engage in things like gerrymandering, where if you're trying to get a Democratic voter to feel like their vote doesn't matter and be more likely to stay home on an off-year election, local elections, stuff like that. It just basically, if you want to get them to check out, a great way to do that is to use gerrymandering techniques to sort of like take away the power of that vote. So it's a broader strategy that exists on the right to basically cultivate a notion that what they're saying is truth, that it's sort of like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways. So it's, again, to sort of go back to the frog in a boiling pot analogy, like, this is the technique. And I always want to try and I feel this inclination to explain to folks that this dynamic is how it works, that it's like it doesn't really matter how much you feel that your vote doesn't matter. It's so imperative to keep showing up and to keep voting and to keep engaging in that process, because to not do so is doing exactly what they want you to do, and that's only going to exacerbate the situation further. Do you think that's like a fair read of the way things are? It's like this is something that goes on in my head, and it's like I have to say it out loud to find out if it has any validity to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's just a really hard case to keep making, right? Like, um, and I think it's because how do you tell people like you have to vote? How do you simultaneously tell people like, on the one hand, yeah, your vote, like, the power of your vote, specifically yours, because of the place you live and the party you're attached to, means less, is less powerful. But because of that, it is more important than ever that you do vote, right? It's like, eh, you know, the human mind has to have two opposing thoughts at the same time to accept that. And it's a pretty nuanced message, right? So I think it's a very challenging thing to explain to people if you're, and I think that's why a lot of Democratic strategists, they don't like talking about gerrymandering, especially in election years, because it introduces those fears and those concerns in the minds of voters. And it creates, like this disincentive to vote. And so you're looking to create every incentive possible, if you're, running an election or if you're running a campaign, for people to get out and vote. And so it's a very challenging issue to run on in that sense. But it's very, very important, and it's one that needs to be handled. And it's also worth saying, like, because we talk about how both parties engage in gerrymandering, which is true, but Democrats are the only party that has like routinely come out and said, introduced legislation both here in New Hampshire and at the federal level, basically trying to abolish gerrymandering, trying to like to to legislate it out of existence, to create constitutional barriers, legal barriers, to ensure there are only fair districts, and only Republicans are the ones who have basically said no. I mean, there were periods in American history where, I think gerrymandering was so absolutely critical to the Republican Party staying in control of state legislatures, and they are worried, I think, that there will be a period where that will happen again, or that, like, I think we're seeing this push now, uh, to get this Texas gerrymandering done, because Republicans know the 2026 midterms, they're going to be devastating. They're going to be so devastating for Republicans if the elections are fair, because, as we talked about, rising prices. Prices are going up everywhere. Tariffs are decimating the economy. Uh, we're seeing one of the worst, a jobs economy in this country that is so bad. Donald Trump had to fire his labor secretary
Yeah.
and replace him
Yeah.
with a completely unqualified conservative crackpot. So, like, things are not obviously not going great for them. So
Right.
they're doing everything they can to create, and that's what's happening here in New Hampshire too. Like, Republicans have been shut out of Congress, our congressional districts, for I think like the last 5 or 6 elections. And there's this, I think, feeling that like, if they don't get this done now, they might never get it done, because people are pissed, and they're probably not feeling overly generous after the way things have gone in the last 6 months.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I saw on your stream, the Granite Gaming stream, you guys were talking about, you mentioned sort of the if you see car ads, right? Uh sort of the big caveat that they're putting on their car ads right now is that current inventory is unaffected by tariffs, right? And which is, so I think, hilarious because they're essentially telling you, like, yeah, once we run out, the tariffs are going to hit those cars and it is going to get more expensive. That's sort of like the omitted part of the ad. But they're trying to sort of assuage your concerns about, like, if you're going to buy a car, you might want to do it now. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's just like, I think a lot of people do understand that there's sort of this like hammer coming down on us as consumers. And I mean, like, again, this is sort of anecdotal, right? But like, if I think about how much I was spending on groceries, like if I went to the grocery store 6 months ago, right? And I was just trying to get like, basics, right? Like I go to the gym, so I'm trying to be more healthy these days. And, it's like, I just,
Honestly,
what I normally
same.
would think. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, honestly, same. Going to the gym.
Yeah, yeah, and it's
Go.
like it's healthy, but I mean, like, I went to the grocery store yesterday, and what I would normally expect to be like you know, and I think this is inflated. What I would normally expect to be like a $45 trip to the grocery store was $84. And it's
Oh yeah.
like, and I'm just getting food for like the next handful of days, right? So, something I sort of have been thinking about is like, oh geez, like I would love to sort of actually sit down and look at like, like do a meal plan and calculate that out and then calculate all my bills and run like a full sort of like budget for myself and then compare it to say like what your average wages are and then actually do a real assessment on like how much money do you actually need to just stay alive in a healthy sense as far as like we're told is what we should be doing, you know what I mean? It just feels really like there's a lot that's sort of slipping away from us, especially on the working class end. Like I always try to focus the content of this channel specifically on more blue collar workers. I am one myself. I work in contracting. I'm a union member. I've worked on movie sets. So it's like I know what it's like to have to go and do, 5, 6, 7 days a week doing 10, 12-hour shifts where you're really just sort of like breaking your back to make money. And then, especially in that industry, it's like it's very like feast or famine, you know what I mean? You'll have a project that goes on for a certain amount of time and then it just bottoms out. And I mean, for what it's worth, the series of strikes that happened a number of years ago with the Writers Guild, Directors Guild, SAG, that really sort of threw the bottom out on that industry. And I think people probably can tell if you go on your streaming services, you notice just sort of like the severe reduction in the amount of shows that we have. What we do have is oftentimes remakes or sequels or, franchise stuff. So there's sort of a dilution of the culture, and then we're also paying more for it on top of that. So there's this sort of like cultural slippage happening at the same time as there's this sort of economic increase, and all of that is sort of contributing to just a general like malaise about the state of living in the country. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I was at Market Basket just yesterday, and I was overhearing a conversation between two strangers who were talking. I kind of dropped in the middle of it. I was just like, I was waiting in the 12 items or less line, and they were talking about something like, "Oh, my kid wants these Pokemon cards," and I perked up because I was like, because we open Pokemon cards on our streams, and I was like, "Oh, what's up?" And she's telling this guy, she's like, "You know what I want? I want not my debt to not go up today." Like
Yeah,
every day
yeah.
it's going up. And she's talking about like how outrageously expensive the price of groceries is. And you're right. I mean, I think everybody is. I mean, you go in for used to be, you had the hand basket and you would check out, and it was like, you know, it was hard to get over $100 in a hand basket, right? And now it's
Right.
like you get it half full and it's $70, and it's just like unbelievable. I mean, it used to be like, oh, I'll eat at home. It's cheaper than eating out. And it's just like every time you go, it's some gut punch. And yeah,
Right.
I don't, it's just, the climate is so dire. And you see companies, I mean, I think companies, like you said, we were talking about these car commercials. I mean, they're they've got their finger on the pulse of what people care about. There's a lot of stories out there about how difficult it is for car companies, for these auto dealerships to move inventory right now because people are freaking the fuck out. I mean, if you lose a job, the odds of you like being able to get another one within like 6 months, very low right now. And, people are definitely holding their savings. They are, they are not feeling confident about the way things are going.
Right, and sort of in a lot of ways, the response is to sort of be like, well, just throw it into the casino that is the stock market, right? Like,
Right.
which actually kind of gives an interesting little pivot to sort of the next thing that I want to talk to you about, which is you just had a article that you published, I believe it was yesterday, about sort of the desire for like with or the desire of conservative politicians to essentially privatize social security. And there's discussion, if you I believe one of the linked articles that you had in your article talked about this idea of the Trump accounts for newborns, where it's like you start out with $1,000 and the motivation is to invest in the stock market so that I thought was so priceless about the article was like they said, well, if it grows, and I was reading that line and I was like, the operative word here is if. Right, it's not a guarantee, and that's the thing, is that if you are getting into the stock market, it really ultimately comes down to whether or not you make a successful investment. And there's a lot of sort of drive on the part of financial experts to fleece people from that money, right? Because if there's the phrase of who's stuck holding the bag. And that's the main concept that exists in stock trading and all that, is that it is in a lot of ways a zero sum game. And whereas in contrast, you've got a program like Social Security where there's just sort of a guaranteed amount because it's coming in through tax dollars. So the discussion there is more about, you're not talking about harm mitigation, you're talking about the precursor to that, which is risk mitigation, right?
Mm.
There's this notion in conservatives that like risk is good. And I think the assertion that I see a lot of people more on the left making, and I think this even exists to the left of the National Democratic Party in a lot of ways, is that like, no, we want the social programs. We'd actually prefer to see it come out in taxes because, especially if you're doing it on like an income tax base, right? That's a flat percentage that's related to how much you make. So it's not regressive in the way that a sales tax or a property tax is, right? So everybody's sort of paying fairly comparatively to what they're able to get in the current economy, but it creates a actual legitimate groundwork of promise and security via Social Security that allows people to actually comfortably retire. So like, oh, I'm not going to be homeless and dying on the street when I'm in my 70s. Whereas like, to put that into a sort of competitive market where there's risk involved in losing, right? There's sort of this illusion that like, oh, well, everybody can be a winner, and that's just simply not true, right? Somebody's always going to lose out, and that operative word if makes it possible for in a lot of ways, for the wealth gap to continue to grow. And so I guess I've gone on a bit here about this broader assertion, but I want to do it to provide context for sort of like some of the background that's happening in your article. So if you want to just sort of explain what you were writing about there and what the goal of sort of illuminating this issue for folks in New Hampshire, and then maybe in the country more broadly, what the goal of that is.
Yeah, totally. So the article you talked about, I'm going to pull it up right here so I don't forget the headline. But yesterday, the 14th, was the 90th anniversary of the signing of the Social Security Act. It is, of course, the first national insurance, social insurance and safety net program. I think a lot, and this is like a topic I think is like really important to communicate to young people. Social Security, like, is like everybody pays into it, right? But you don't get to take advantage of it until you're older. So I think, especially in this day and age where attention spans are dramatically reduced, it is kind of one of those issues that's really hard to talk about for certain audiences, for younger audiences especially. But it's very, very important because it's going to be critical to so many people later in life. But as you said, this article I wrote yesterday, top 2026 NHGOP Senate candidates backdoor for privatizing Social Security. And basically what this article is, I just wanted to, I knew the 90th anniversary of Social Security was coming up. A lot of people were talking about it. So I just wanted to do a little research on where everybody was. Like, so there's this Senate race coming up, 2026 here in New Hampshire. Jean Shaheen, longtime, mainstay of state politics, has said she is not going to be running for another term. And so it is a very rare open Senate seat. A number of candidates have already come forward and said they are going to be running. On the Democratic side, we have Congressman Chris Pappas, a long, I think 3 or 4 term member of Congress from New Hampshire. Very, very good fundraiser. Very, very good at running elections. And then you have 2 Republican candidates. One of them is a Massachusetts politician, Scott Brown, former senator from Massachusetts, now wants to be a senator for New Hampshire, which is a whole other thing. And then you have
Having a hard time escaping those carpetbagger accusations there.
It's hard. I mean, like, especially coming off of the governor's race in 2024, where the whole headline of that race was "Don't mass up in New Hampshire." Like the idea, like it's like such a Veep-like idea that this Massachusetts politician could waltz in here. And anyway, and then you have a Republican state senator, Dan Innes, who is his own brand of lunacy. But anyway, so I wanted to see, like, okay, like, 90th anniversary of this very important program. Politics are more insane than they've ever been. Like, Republicans are, they're not acting like they're approaching a vulnerable midterm election. They're just kind of taking Donald Trump's, like, act insane and act like, there's no tomorrow, and tact, and just seeing how it works. So I wanted to see where these guys were, what they were saying. I thought it was really interesting because, as you would expect, Chris Pappas, the Democrat, he's basically a big proponent of keeping Social Security the way it is. And these 2 Republicans, Dan Innes and Scott Brown, they are both in different ways basically saying, like, yeah, we probably need to privatize Social Security. We think it makes more sense to take on risk for people retiring. And it's like you said, privatizing Social Security, extremely risky. It's the whole idea of Social Security is that it is risk averse, that it is this guaranteed money that you could take it. And the whole idea of privatizing it is, like you said, it benefits basically the corporate donor class of the Republican Party, which is why I think in large part they want to privatize it. They'll say it's like an ideological crusade, but really, I mean, it seems like every major Republican ideological crusade is some corporate backed, some major giveaway to corporate interests that will ultimately give money to the party. So that's what we're dealing with in that story. I think what was really shocking for me was a clip I found of a radio interview from Scott Brown recently, who basically, he said, like, seniors don't care about Social Security. Like, they don't care. Like, it's wild to me. He said this in a radio interview, the idea that
right,
don't care. But also he repeated, when we were going through Elon Musk's Doge phase, there were so many lies, so much misinformation about Social Security payments and who was getting them. The idea that, like, 150-year-olds were collecting payments. He was, like, very willing to take that lie and push it, which as an excuse to get rid of Social Security, as an excuse to privatize it, which I thought was like, for somebody who's running for a Senate seat in purple New Hampshire, an old, a state like you said is older, where a lot of the population, I'd have to look up the number. It's something like what is it? I know it's over 300,000 Granite Staters. Yeah, so something
Yeah,
like,
your article says it's 334,100 Granite
right,
Staters.
that's like 20% of the state is collecting Social Security, right? More than 20% of the state at that point is collecting Social Security. Why? And a lot of people are approaching that point and are probably keeping an eye on it. Why are you, as in many ways, the front runner for the 2026 Senate seat on the Republican side, why are you lying about Social Security? Why are you saying things that could be damaging to you later about Social Security? I thought that was a weird move on his part. He's done that in a few other ways in terms of like lying to support Trump administration priorities, but like very easily fact check lies. So I thought that was
Yeah.
fascinating. One of the more fascinating parts of the story, Dan Ennis has his own, it's like in his policy platform to allow the privatization of Social Security, which I mean is a little more mundane, but it's also very very damaging, very risky.
Right. Well, so this actually, I'm glad we're sort of on this topic, right? Because to sort of look at things a little bit more nationally right now.
Mm.
You look at sort of Trump's press conferences, right? And this is I'm probably going to be asking you to go into things more as just from your perspective as a journalist, right? Um, if you look at like the press conference where Trump's talking about what happened in Los Angeles, right? The protests that happened in Los Angeles. He's talking about how, oh yeah, the whole city was burning and like realistically, if you go admittedly, I do find myself consuming a bit of Hassan Piker's content from time to time. And but I remember watching the stream that he did where he actually went to the protests. And and there's other video. There were plenty of other people streaming from that day. So it's like, if you don't like him, that's fine. You don't have to necessarily watch his content. There's plenty of other people that were there that had their camera phones out and they were recording things. And so far as I could tell, the only burning that happened that day was a handful of Waymos, right? Like, now I'm not saying that this is something that we should be condoning, right? Like, I don't agree that you should set stuff on fire in acts of protest. But it is fundamentally a blatant lie. And the fact that you could just go to the protest and then walk around a corner into another neighborhood and get a cup of ice cream or something like that is really sort of obfuscating what actually happened there. When realistically, if you want to talk about California burning, you could talk about the actual wildfires that occurred, which the Trump administration refused to offer help for, right? So the one time California was actually burning, Trump didn't do anything about it. And so I think it's just like, as a reporter, for you to watch sort of those press conferences and then see the lack of pushback in that press room, like, what do you feel like this is doing to sort of just the more classical concept of adversarial journalism, right? I think a lot of people were applauding a recent appearance that Alyssa Slotkin did on a program called Breaking Points, where she was being interviewed by Crystal Ball. And Crystal Ball really kind of like held her feet to the fire in terms of her positions on Gaza and what she would or would not vote for. A lot of people on the internet reacted very positively to the way Crystal did that and were saying like, oh, look, there's real journalism happening here. It's actually adversarial and people are genuinely sort of putting her feet to the fire. And so I guess on a more local level, I'm sort of curious what your position is, because there's realistically, New Hampshire's not the whole nation, right? And I think this is something that, like, for people that watch this channel, whether you're from New Hampshire or not, right? It's important to scale your expectations when you're talking about things that happen on the actual state level, right? And what you can and can't get away with, and understanding who your audience is, what the climate is like, the extent to which you're able to push things. And so I'm sort of curious what your take is in terms of like what's the space that sort of media needs to be occupying on a more micro level, in terms of reporting, while also sort of maintaining a sense of traditional adversarial journalism techniques.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's something I think about all the all the time, because I've only, I started my career in journalism, and then I kind of moved into politics, and it's only in the last year, little more than a year, that I've come back to journalism, and so in a lot of ways, I had to kind of put my money where my mouth was in terms of my coverage and my willingness to do stuff. And I think my perspective is much different from my colleagues throughout the rest of the New Hampshire Press Corps. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think you see there's a strong parallel I see kind of in the White House press corps that you would see in kind of a state politics press corps, which is this. I think there's a fear of on the I guess I would say on like the government side, there is a lot more hostility to reporters than we've kind of ever seen before. And then there's, I think, a response on the reporter side that that they don't want to lose access. They're sensitive to that, right? They react to that, I think, in a way, in a fear based way. And so I think that shapes their coverage to a certain extent. And I think that's really concerning. So at the White House level, like we've already seen Caroline Levitt, or Triple K, as most New Hampshire political people call her behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Um, we're seeing, a willingness to basically shut out whole press organizations, the AP, the Washington Post, if they don't like the coverage. And I think you see, the rest of the press corps basically say quiet after that because they know they're going to get kicked out too. So there's more of a level, like much higher level of compliance, and I guess I would call it, what do they call it, pre compliance.
Yeah.
Uh, so they don't want to rock the boat. They want to maintain their ability to stay in the White House, stay in the briefing room, and so they don't ask the tough questions, and so we don't get those important moments, really toothless stuff. And then, here in New Hampshire, Kelly Ayotte, the governor, I think there's been, uh, you know, there hasn't been a governor more unfriendly to the press, probably maybe in the state's history. I know I've only been along so long, but like this is somebody who routinely never answers my emails, routinely never answers the emails of some of the top media organizations in the state about very important stuff. And I think also puts a lot of a lot of that into the agency heads as well. So, if I'm reaching out to the DOJ, if I'm reaching out to other state agencies, I won't get my emails back. I know other reporters who have the exact same problem, because that the governor works so closely to make sure that they're not saying anything out of turn. And I think it really creates. And then you see reporters here, you know, who are, I think, afraid to a certain extent to lose what little access they then have, because they know that this is a governor who's not willing to be beholden to the press, to a governor who doesn't really respect a free press. And so they want to make sure if there's a situation they need to get an answer on, maybe even without that guarantee, they want to make sure that they're not, hurting anyone's feelings or damaging any relationships. So I think they'll shy away from coverage that is, on the one hand, very honest and critical, but could be potentially damaging. So I think there's, both at the federal level and the state level, we're seeing kind of a worse climate for reporters than maybe ever. I like to think of myself as somebody who because I'm more newer to journalism myself, and I don't know, I don't feel the concern to burn bridges to get what I want from a story or what I want from people, and so
Yeah, so that's
that's
something that I'm
more my type.
yeah, no, I mean, I'm genuinely curious about that though, because it's sort of easy to point it out with like conservatives, but I think there's actually like a genuine like question about that around sort of like Democratic politicians as well, right? If the, the idea being like, oh well, we're in this sort of like hyper authoritarian state right now, so like why would you be challenging the Democrats on anything? Why would you ever like do anything other than be nice to them and supportive of them? Because if you don't have this sort of like constant positive like upbeat, glazing type of a tone with them, that they would suddenly stop communicating with you about what's going on. Like I've had my own sort of like contentious interactions with Ray Buckley, right? And I know that I don't think Ray would ever agree to sit down and have a conversation with me on this channel. As much as I would love that, right? And
Right.
the problem I have with that is like I'm very openly on the left, you know what I mean? I think like ideologically, I probably sit somewhere between a social democrat and a democratic socialist. That's just my personal position. But it doesn't mean that I'm not willing to like have a conversation with a liberal or a conservative or a libertarian for that matter, right? Like, because I understand that like in order for my political project to actually gain any traction or any value in the world, like I have to be willing to meet people where they're at to a certain extent and actually have honest, reasonable conversations with them in order to get somewhere, like anywhere at all. And it's like, I feel like there's sort of this, I mean, I think about it in terms of like it, to use more online parlance, right? This sort of like snowflake culture, right? Where people are just fucking like really sensitive to just the general tone of the way that somebody approaches something. It's like, look, like I can say something that challenges you super directly and out front, and like that might, cause your body to produce like cortisol, and you're feeling sort of like the pit in your stomach, like you just broke a window when you were a kid with a baseball, right? That doesn't mean that like we can't like just talk about shows that we like together afterwards. That doesn't mean we can't sit down and have a meal together and respect each other as human beings. And I feel like, this is something that I say a lot of times where I'm like, look, like people need to grow thicker skin when it comes to social interactions and being able to deal with things. And people need to be willing to actually not just write somebody off because they challenged them one time. And so I'm always sort of curious, like, do you think that there's sort of a general fear that journalists in the state might have when talking to Democratic lawmakers, policymakers, whatever, that sort of prevents them from saying what's really on their mind because they don't want to, as you said it, burn the bridge of a connection to where like, oh, I can't just hit this person up to get even an off the record take from them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, right? And it's a really good question. It's a really interesting one. It's one I think about all the time. And I think there's a couple things going on. And I think, one part of it is that, like you said, we're living in uh, a society that is quickly descending into authoritarianism. And so I think there's a serious, it's really hard to focus on like what Democrats are doing because they are like both at the state level and the federal level so powerless, right? And Republicans have gotten so good at this, at like managing the news cycle on the day to day. But it is so important that we do look at what Democrats are doing and we do take a critical eye, not just to like I don't know, to the legislation that they're putting, but the tactics, the political tactics they're using, whether they're effective, and having that critical eye. And I wish there was more coverage around that because I think it is very important to look at that. I honestly I think there's like a certain expertise gap when it comes to I think the ability for some reporters to critique, I think, political strategy and political, um, I would say,
Maybe instincts.
strategy. But, you know, like when you're looking at political communication strategy, where you're looking at, um, you know, political strategy broadly, you know, what works, what doesn't work, what you know, what is good and what is bad. I think it takes a certain level of expertise to like say like, especially in the moment, right? Because after an election, after something is over, very easy to see like that was bad, that was good. But in the moment, I think it's very challenging, and I think there needs to be a lot more of it. And it's also important to know what is important to talk about, and what, like, the topics that are truly worth discussing when it comes to like efficacy in combating this authoritarianism, in like, especially like a state politics level, because I think there's a lot of people who want to talk about maybe national issues that local politicians are not uh, either equipped to talk about, or they don't have a lot of say in. And I think there's a lot more appetite for that, because that's the kind of thing that plays online. Whereas when you talk about things like gerrymandering, when you talk about things like electricity prices, energy prices, things that like are very like malleable at the state level and important to talk about, there's less.
And also tangible for the consumer and the voter, right? Like those are way more,
Yes.
like if you talk about like what was everybody's number one issue when it came to the presidential election, it was the economy, right? Like
Yeah,
that's what voters actually care about, you know, like when they're really going to the booth to put their vote in, it's the focus is on the economy.
right, exactly. And that, I think, is something that there needs to be a lot more examination on what state level Democrats, what the state party is kind of, how they are handling that, how they're handling that conversation, how they're approaching that. And yeah, I wish there was more of that. I'd like to do more of that myself, because I think there is um, a lot of room for improvement when it comes to that, because those are very important matters. And like, and you know, accountability on that on both sides just needs to get a lot better.
Right. Like, so, I mean, for what it's worth, like, I have this sort of general hypothesis, right? I've had it for a long time
Yeah.
that people are really starved for authenticity, right? Like we have uh we have sort of like a general culture that really rewards like performativeness. If you're looking at just sort of like the way that social media operates, right? If you're looking at like TikTok and what people are doing and how, you know, it's like you put on all these filters and you do all this stuff and you're presenting yourself to everybody and you're really like obfuscating the stuff that you're dealing with in your life. And I think like it's like eating way too much junk food, right? Eventually you just get sick of it and you're like, God, I need some vitamins and protein, right? Like, and I think that there's generally like this sort of hunger that people have, maybe if they're not even able to identify it yet, to have something that's like genuinely more substantial, that actually validates like what they're feeling in their lizard brain about like to, you know, about sort of like their state of being, right? I think we've done a really good job of sort of jamming that sort of long-term thinking into the subconscious by way of sort of like creature comforts. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And I think the more you see things like your creature comforts get consumed by sort of the gamification of our society, right? Like you brought up Pokemon cards, and I think this is a really interesting example, right? If you wanted to go and buy Pokemon cards back in say January, right? It's classic millennial here. I'm totally in on it. So I think if you wanted to go buy Pokemon cards back in January, right, you could go to like CVS or Shaw's and you could actually buy packs like off the shelf. You could buy booster packs and you can get them for real. And now when you try to go, you have to, you're simply not going to get them at a place like Walmart or again, pharmacies, right? The place you're going to get them is you're going to get them at GameStop. And if you're going to do it, you have to make sure that you talk to the GameStop representatives and ask them like, okay, when's your delivery? Right? Like, when is that happening? And like there have been reports of people that will literally like mark the car of the person that's delivering Pokemon cards to GameStops and then go like basically stalk them and sort of like, it's like that person goes, I read an article where somebody was going to get gas, right? She was like delivering Pokemon cards, she went to go get gas and had to call the police on somebody for essentially assaulting her, trying to get her to just hand over the Pokemon cards in the car, right? And like
Yeah.
then you see, and basically the idea is that these people are scalpers, right? What they're doing is they're buying up massive quantities of Pokemon cards, then resell. So you're looking at like another secondary market that basically causes greater inflation on this just like creature comfort. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, what it's doing is it's preventing like, well, who's the target audience of Pokemon cards, right? It's like children. It's not even necessarily people like you or I. It's literally kids. Like that's the intended target of the like consumer base. And so I always think about like the parent whose kid just, as you said in that line, like wants that pack of Pokemon cards, and that parent can't even do anything about it because it's now been sort of siphoned off into this secondary market. So even our basic creature comforts are being consumed by this sort of weird, like, you know, commodification that's happening, like hyper commodification that's happening. And you have like apps that allow you to track the value of your Pokemon cards. So you can look at your Pokemon card portfolio, and there's jokes about how Pokemon cards are now the stocks for millennials and so on and so forth. And just like, I think it's a really interesting sort of case example of like, look, like this is how far off base we've gotten. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, it's a. I could go on a whole thing about Pokemon cards. Don't even get me started. But it is fascinating. It's a fascinating byproduct of just how, especially the idea of nostalgia, like being a token of investment. It's a fascinating bit of I don't know what you'd even call it. Like speculative fiction could never have hyped it up. It's very very interesting and a weird reflection of where we are. And I think a lot of like a good example of like economic anxiety across the board, right? People that are taking their hobbies. I mean, in every category, I think, because so many other card games, you're seeing like their their values go up, and it's just this reflection of like, how can I commodify basically every part of my life because I'm being strained. A normal full time job is just not gonna not be enough to live the full life that my parents and my grandparents had. Now I have to like commodify my hobbies too. My hobbies have to become an investment. Otherwise, they're not, worth my time. It's a very interesting economic thing. But I still love ripping packs. So I
Hey, I mean, I'm
can't.
not, no shade on it, but it's like, no, I
It's
genuinely
stable.
think about
Best
this
game
a
in the
lot
game.
though. Like because it,
Right.
it touches a lot of different parts of our sort of like society. I mean, like, for what it's worth, like I'm an electronic musician. I got into like making music. I do video, obviously. I went to school for it. And one thing that, it's like going to art school, one thing that I sort of like my general experience, and I know this isn't the experience of everybody, but it was like what I found is that there was a lot of situations where it wasn't like how well you did or how successful your piece of artwork wasn't necessarily associated in any way shape or form with the craftsmanship that went into it, right? It really came down to like how well you could argue the value of the piece or like what your artist statement was. And that really sort of like disillusioned me from just pursuing that as a career path, because I was like, I genuinely cared about sort of the craftsmanship of the product and what was going into it, and sort of like the intentionality. And then, it's like with music, going and doing, producing albums and stuff like that, like there were plenty of opportunities that I had to maybe go and just like produce boilerplate trap beats for rappers and just sort of sell them on, whatever website you could use to sort of like auction off your beats. And I just never wanted to do that. I was like, I don't want to be chained by sort of like the cultural demands of normativity that society has around these particular outlets. Like, I just want to make the thing I want to make, and I'll keep putting it out there, and I'll sort of like just remove like very concerted, directed effort that I had in my life to pursue this path, and just basically hobbyify it, and then just sort of sit back and hope that eventually somebody discovers it and enjoys it. And and so for my part, it's like, okay, well, if I'm doing that, then like the fan base that I cultivate is much more genuine, and again, to go back to it, it's sort of like authentic, right? But it means you're on a much slower burn, and it might very well never pay off in your lifetime. So you're then having to find a way to sort of like split the difference, and then go into a field that maybe is just like purely exists to pay the bills. You know what I mean? But
Mm.
then you're dealing with the fact that time is limited. There's only so many hours in the day. So how much time do I have in the day to work versus how much time do I have to put into this passion that I have? And then separately, how much time do I have to put into, just relaxing or just like turning my brain off entirely? And I think that creates a serious degree of exhaustion for people, right? Like, at what point do we all just start to burn out and check out? And then we don't have the mental capacity to do things like actually like follow the link that's in the news article to like see whether or not the person that wrote this article is even telling me the truth. It's just sort of like it's a weird place to be in. And I know I'm sort of just trailing on and on here about sort of my own personal anecdotes, but it's like I always want to sort of have these conversations with journalists, because I feel like you guys are really like on it's like I'm not a journalist in the more like traditional sense. I try to look towards journalism and use it as like look at journalistic practices, look at more academic practices to try and inform the way that I approach like making this content, right? Because it's like I respect it and I honor it and I want to follow that tradition, because I think it's actually what provides substantive material for people to base their opinions off of. But again, I'm not that professionally. Whether or not I would like to be is a separate issue. But I think it's like it's important to discuss that with people that do it professionally, because it's like you're there, you're not just talking to the elected officials, you guys are also going out and just talking to regular folks on the street. So it's like you've got a unique perspective on the lived experiences of a pretty broad swath of folks. And so my question is always like, well, how much do people sort of like, how much of this is internalized? And even if people aren't able to like fully describe it, how much of it is like displaying the consciousness of this experience despite not necessarily having the words to fully illustrate it to another person? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, the whole, I think what really distinguishes the Granite Post and like my work uh, from, I think, other New Hampshire news outlets is like one of the uh, core conceits of our work is that we have to meet our readers where they are. And but readers, viewers, like we just have to meet people where they are, right? And that's why, like, when you are, like me, I like when I was coming out of college, like I went to school for journalism, but I could not for the life of me find a reporting job right out of college. It was a bad time for the economy, and I was all kinds of reasons. I was like couldn't move at the time, and I was like, and I just I had to like just get a job. So I was working in a factory, and I was actually working in like a ceramics silk screening factory right out of college, where I worked for like a little over a year. My shift started at 4 in the morning because we used this kiln that would get so hot we couldn't work in it in the day because the temperatures in the building would get too high and you would pass out. So we had to start at 4 in the morning, and then our shift would end at like I don't know, like 11 a.m. or something. And so I would go home, and like the only thing I had the energy to do, I wanted to do so much. Obviously, I wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to like, I had all these, ideas about the kind of work I wanted to do, but only thing I could do was like get on my phone and doom scroll and then like pass the fuck out. And so that's
Yeah.
like, the idea that like, and I think that's a very relatable thing, right? Because like, you know, we I think people's jobs are so punishing and so exhausting. Everyone has like things they want to pursue and like creative interests or alternative professional interests, and it's just just trying to exist and survive in this country that the boomers have made for us is just
Yeah.
so in so many ways. It is, and so cruel in so many ways. Just trying to like get food and a ceiling over your head is so tough. So recognize that, and recognize people as a result, people have very narrow attention spans, very, and people treat their free time, one way or another. They treat it with a lot of respect. So we want to make sure that, what, news and like news, politics, policy, especially at the state level, very fucking complicated, very nuanced. Like, there's and years and years and years of stuff and context to cram into like this super narrow window, very challenging. So, and I think a lot of news organizations, especially legacy ones, newspapers, major newspapers, they're not they don't even think about people like that, right? they're
Yeah.
they're still writing articles that are either being published online that take 20-25 minutes to read, something like that, or in print, um, and they're making, and for financial reasons, for non-financial reasons, they're not changing, they're not trying to meet people where they are, not trying to meet the public where they are, um, or if they are, they're doing a really bad job. So I'm trying to, for me, that is like the most important thing, right? Like reaching people where they are, which is probably doom scrolling at
Yeah.
11 o'clock at night, before they go to bed or when they wake up, and just giving them the lowest barrier to entry possible for like some information about what's happening in their state. And occasionally we're successful, which is great, but it is just so hard to get important information in front of people these days. And I like to think the model we have is doing that to a certain extent with some success, definitely more than almost any other news organization in the state. But yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there. It is tough. It is tough for almost anybody to get a sense of what is happening, not just at the federal level, not at the national level, but at the state level. That's really tough, and it's so overlooked. And I think but it's also so important, right? Because local
Yeah.
elections, who you elect locally, has the greatest like actual impact on your day-to-day life. So the
Well, and I
more
think
I can
like
do
something to sort of add to that, right, is like um you people forget that national level politicians don't just like suddenly pop into existence out of thin air, right? They start out as just regular people in a place, right? Like Pete Buttigieg, okay? The guy was mayor of South Bend, Indiana. You know what I mean? Like and that's like one of the greatest examples of like leapfrogging from like a very, very low place to a very, very high place very, very quickly. But even then, right? If you're not sort of like taking the time to clue in on what's happening on more local level issues, you might very well miss your chance to sort of like interrupt or engage with somebody who could go on to exert like incredible amounts of power to like on significantly larger populations, right? And I think like for what it's worth, it's like I try to focus more on the state level stuff, where it's like if I'm going to talk about national stuff, like I want to be able to do it through a state level lens so that I can help connect those like disparate pieces to people. Because I think like something we see a lot of problems with is sort of like the over academic sphere of policymakers and educational like sort of like higher education facilities and whatnot. These organizations are like they feel very sort of like opaque to a lot of just regular blue collar workers, because they're like, dude, I haven't read all those fucking books. Like, I didn't take all those fucking classes. Like, I went to trade school. Go fuck yourself. Like, I have to do my job, and it's like, there's this huge disconnect between like the actual like incredibly intricate academic space where all of this stuff is really taking place, and then just like the regular working class American, right? And so I think it's like a lot of media should be seeking at this moment in time to say, do the classic thing, which is, where's the vacuum? You sort of like determine where's the vacuum of information, and you decide to fill that vacuum, right? You want to look for what's missing, and you want to fill that space. And what's often missing and in that space is the bridge between sort of the broader academic context and then the regular working class, which is something that was fairly strong in the United States if you want to look back to, say, like the New Deal era, right, where we had a significant like much more literacy in the working class around, say, like the value of a union and sort of like the interaction between sort of corporate interests and the working class, right? And there was a lot more awareness that existed during that time period. And I think a big project that occurred was to sort of separate the working class from that knowledge or that exposure, and then to sort of use things like red baiting and whatnot to divide people using things like redlining, which is a type of, functionally, to go back to our earlier conversation, gerrymandering, to separate people and create lines of division in the working class so that there's a lot of direct infighting between people. And then also simultaneously this sort of like vilification of having any kind of awareness of the concepts that are explored in higher education. So you're creating this sort of like intellectual divide of like, academic elites versus just regular working class people. And I think there's a lot to be said for trying to dive into that space as media outlets and trying to use like very sort of like just common language to explain these much more verbose concepts that get expressed in policy discussions. It's like nobody wants to go learn legalese just to understand what the fuck's happening with their electric bill. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm really lucky. We have this Granite Gaming live stream. We stream Tuesdays and Thursdays at noon, and we play games. We talk about politics. I'm really lucky because my co-host Angel, who is our social media guru at the Granite Post, she is really not like a political person and is like really great at just telling me to shut the fuck up when I veer too much on the policy end, and like you have to like normal people don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You have to say it more clearly. And I'm like, oh, thank God, somebody there to do that. Because when you have your head down in this stuff too long, it's very easy to get lost. And and it's become such a major problem for the Democratic Party. You've got like people who have no idea how to solve it, trying to figure it out. But yeah, I'm very lucky to have somebody who's got my back for that and helps me do that. And everyone needs, especially people who work in politics or in journalism, I think needs to have somebody on their case a lot more that's telling them to simplify things, because there needs to be, you need to be using language that normal people understand, and you need to there's just no other alternative, right? Because if you're not talking in a way people understand you, you're not doing your job.
I couldn't
Hmm.
agree more. I think it's sort of like, from my perspective, it's a breath of fresh air to see somebody like you and to see an organization like
Hmm.
Granite Post trying to just like go ahead and do this kind of work. You know what I mean? Again, I don't want to be so like, I recognize there's sort of the trappings of being overly friendly to guests on the show, but at the same time, like I don't disagree with what you're saying. So I think the work you're doing is really important, and I would encourage anybody sort of watching the channel right now to go check out Granite Post, read Colin's articles, because they are very well written. It's not difficult to make it through them. And then also just, like tune in to Granite Gaming, man. I think you guys are doing a really awesome channel. I'm still holding out for the day that we get to see a Helldivers 2 playthrough. And if
It's coming. It's
maybe we'll
coming.
do a maybe I'll try and have you
Yeah.
back on at some point. We'll do our own little Helldivers 2 stream or something like that.
No, we're like, I would say like a month or month and a half away from having guests on. But once we do, you will be on there too. We should do a Helldiver stream.
I would love
Absolutely.
to, man. I would
Let's
absolutely love
go.
to join you guys. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Colin, today. I just like thank you so much for your time. I know like this has been a bit longer of a stream than I usually do for interviews, but I think there's just like I could keep talking to you for hours, man. Like there's so much to get into.
Totally.
And it's been a real pleasure to just sort of explore all these different facets of what's going on. And there's a high likelihood that I'll check back in with you as sort of more completely absurd, banal dystopia news occurs in our current situation, both on the state and national level, because realistically, it's all going to touch us one way or another.
Awesome. Thanks, man. It's
So
great to be here. And yeah, let's talk again soon, huh?
this has been our interview with Colin. If you enjoy the content on this channel, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube and follow us on Patreon. Become a subscriber. You can support the channel and help sort of keep this whole thing going. And yeah, fantastic, guys. Thank you so much, and we'll catch up with you soon.